Genndy Tartakovsky's Primal is an Adult Swim animated series that premiered across 2019 and 2020. Following caveman Spear and Tyrannosaur Fang in their constant struggle to survive in an exotic world of prehistoric beasts, pestilent witchcraft and feral civilizations. United by tragedy but bound for survival, Spear and Fang navigate this dangerous land without a single word of dialogue, as they grow to become a close team, and eventually acquire a third member to their party as well, before the season ends. Primal is unpredictable, violent and badass, but it's also heartfelt, poignant and loaded with pathos. With a sprinkling of fact from our own natural world, let's dive in to see the who, what and how of their primordial journey. The first episode, and indeed the character names, are a reference to the short story of Stone Age fantasy by Robert E. Howard, creator of Conan the Barbarian. Spear and Fang is the story of a cave girl Aea, kidnapped by an outdated depiction of a Neanderthal, before being rescued. Because the world of Primal harkens back to the pulp adventure novels of the first half of the 20th century, such as those mentioned by Howard, or Conan Doyle's The Lost World, Edgar Rice Burroughs' Caprona or Pellucidar, and plenty of influence from Ray Harryhausen's stop-motion classics, like The Valley of Gwangi. The episode opens in beauty, with Spear busy fishing in a tranquil forest river. This is broken in seconds by a lunge from a giant crocodile, perhaps Deinosuchus. There's no separation between the picturesque Eden and the powerful predators it houses, and we already see the unapologetic and anachronistic mixing of people and extinct fauna, like the various inspirations of Primal. As photographer Hugo van Lawick put it, this is a savage paradise. The weekly shop done, Spear heads back home, having another harrowing brush from death from a giant as dark-eyed pterosaur. Again, these near-constant life-and-death moments are just day-to-day experiences for Spear, who is as much prey for these beasts as the fish are he just caught. We see the valley Spear lives in, and again, it's beautiful. The world of Primal is a mash of the Paleozoic, Mesozoic and Cenozoic, like its inspirations which had people living alongside anachronistic dinosaurs, in a symbolic image of retro media. The world's terrain ranges from frigid tundra to lush rainforests and everything in between. Spear seems to have chosen the latter for his home, but all may not be well, as he finds an ominous footprint, and it becomes clear why the word theropod translates into beast foot. Spear's daily commute becomes a rush when it becomes clear his home is under threat, and he arrives back just in time to see his family massacred by a pack of horned theropods. Spear does what he can to fight back, but he's already too late, and as it turns out, the pack are seemingly just juveniles led by a single massive adult. Titanic size, a huge robust head equipped with deep powerful jaws, and small arms tipped with two-fingered hands, it seems the assailants are likely a species of massive, fictitious tyrannosaur, equipped even further with devilish horns. Horned theropods are present through the fossil record with animals like Ceratosaurus and Carnotaurus. They're often a quick way in fan art and original creations to turn a plainer theropod into something more brutish. Both the species mentioned have had retro depictions that are arguably far more ferocious than the real animal, such as Disney's Carnotaurus and Ray Harryhausen's stop-motion Ceratosaurus. Real-life large carnivorous dinosaurs were also well equipped for head-to-head combat, even ones without horns like tyrannosaurs, who still possessed very robust skulls well adapted to take great stresses. Some have suggested that they rammed each other as well as engaging in biting. In a world of such evolutionary extremity as Primal, the horned tyrannosaurs can be taken as having exaggerated the characteristics of our greatest theropod to something even more deadly. But of course, none of this matters to Spear, who has just lost everything. He enters his home to see the smouldering remains of the fire they would have cooked his catch on, and the wall of the cave shows where the family had painted handprints together, possibly marking the growth of their children, or just to show the world that they were there. Spear looks at a drawing on the wall of him and his family, and wipes it away. He changes the message to the world. They are no longer there, and neither is he. The next scene shows Spear making an incredible climb, and when he reaches the top, his goal is clear, as he plans to end his own life. But the urge to hang on is powerful in any living thing, and Spear can't quite step off the edge, instead spending the whole night perched there. But then the sun also rises, as it will every day, and Spear's mood changes. He sees an image of his family and seems restored by it. And the sun is important to Spear's culture. The first action a father does on the birth of a child is to bathe the child in sunlight. And sunlight is generally important to hominids. It has a myriad of health benefits, and it's important to both our growth when young, and significantly to our mental health. We see in both this season and the next that forms of the afterlife do exist in Primal, but they aren't universal or uniform, with some being dependent on a judgment with realms akin to heaven and hell, and others reuniting you with those you've lost who wait for you. There are even some hints that non-hominid species may have something after death too. It's not impossible that Spear and his kin do have an afterlife, and it's connected to this sun worship, hence why he sees his family now. With everything to come, they may now know he's still needed in this world, and he still has more to do. The warm rays of the dawn may be the final word Spear needs to push onwards, and he decides to persevere. We later find him at the river again after a successful catch, but in the trees he spots the silhouette of another tyrannosaur, and sets off in pursuit. Unknown to him, this isn't one of the horned brood, but in fact the second protagonist, Fang, a more normal and hornless tyrannosaur, defined by her extra-large tusk-like tooth on the lower jaw. She shares Spear's appetite for fish, and grabs a mouthful for her young. When Spear catches up and rushes to confront her, he realises not only is this not the animal that killed his family, but he's just rushed in on a defensive mother. The two square off, but before anything can escalate, one of the horned brood arrives and a fight quickly breaks out. Fang defends her offspring, and Spear seems to have the realization that he can prevent the same tragedy happening to another family, and picks a side. As Spear attacks, Fang kills one of the horned brood by using her immense tyrannosaur jaws to literally bite its skull in half. Spear takes on the final member. He shatters its horn with a rock and clings to its head, tearing out one of its own teeth to stab it with, and then finally spearing it through the chest. Despite having won vengeance for his family, Spear just collapses after the fight. The deaths of the horned brood have not brought his family back, and he's no less alone than he was before. Until he isn't. Fang's chicks come to investigate and begin to tug his hair, and Spear seems to enjoy playing with them, a smile actually coming onto his face for the first time since his family were killed. But unfortunately this doesn't last, as the mother of the horned tyrannosaurs arrives, and the mother consumes Fang's chicks. A second fight breaks out. But as we root for Spear and Fang, it's worth noting all of the participants are actually in the same boat. Each one has lost its children to the other. We may not be in her camp, but as with every struggle in nature, the mother tyrannosaur has as much cause to want Spear and Fang dead as vice versa. The new duo attack the mother tyrannosaur, but singly neither can land an effective hit. Spear leaps onto Fang's back, and despite some initial resistance, their new partnership allows them to take down the mother, as they ride up her back and sever her brainstem. With the tyrant slain, Fang now joins Spear in recognizing her loss. Vengeance has been sought, but her young are still gone forever, and Spear leaves the grieving dinosaur by her nest. Later, as Spear wanders the beach, the two meet again. Fang has seemingly followed Spear. Right now, they're effectively the only thing the other has left. And in that moment, the partnership between Fang and Spear is formed. Episode 2 is River of Snakes, and opens with Spear on the hunt as he chases down a wild pig. With speed and skill, he runs it down and then gets a perfect shot. Or would if Fang didn't recklessly steal the kill, not only taking Spear's food but almost getting herself impaled in the process. Spear can only watch wordlessly as a morning's hunt is wasted. The afternoon finds Spear readying up for a second attempt, but Fang has her eyes on the same target. Each tried to one-up the other to the kill. Fang outpaced Spear. Spear camouflages himself. Fang chases the hog. Spear gets ahead and actually kills it, only for Fang to once again eat the carcass in its entirety. She is an adult tyrannosaur after all. It's all Spear can do to sit down, rub the mud off, and eat some bug. Fang also tries to steal that as well. Going for the vegetarian option instead, Fang also ruins that, knocking Spear from the tree and then making a new discovery that tyrannosaurs will also occasionally eat fruit. Spear's patience boils over and he shoves Fang. Whatever strength this relationship is built on, it's clearly in its teething stages. Hungry and tired, Spear can't even sleep that night for Fang's constant snoring. Instead, he entertains himself by making shadow puppets, and we see he used to make these with assorted sound effects to entertain his children at home. Suddenly, the shadow puppets become the horned tyrannosaur, and Spear has a flashback of the day of his family's death. Unsurprisingly, this suggests some post-traumatic stress disorder, and Spear also seems angry at Fang. The tensions only rise. The next morning, the two set off and pass a great waterfall as a storm brews overhead. Spotting a tasty ungulate, the two set off in pursuit, and once again Fang steals the kill. And for Spear, this is it. The frustration scales to physical violence, and whilst the two clearly aren't trying to kill each other, it's still days of pent-up aggression coming forth in very genuine hostility. This builds until Fang snaps Spear's spear, and he grabs 2 logs to use instead. The two are now so consumed with fighting one another, they fail to realise they've wandered into a nest of giant snakes. Snakes aren't exactly renowned for their social behaviour, but as well as hibernating together, mother snakes will often stick close to their young until their first shed, at which point they're on their own. Considering there is a much larger single snake to come that seems the same species, it seems likely they've just wandered straight into a nest. The storm breaks, and Spear, Fang, the snakes, and the whole forest are washed into the swollen river, being swept towards the waterfall. The mother herself is swept towards them, a truly giant serpent some 100 foot in length at least. Titan boa, the largest snake in our world, maxed out at a mere 40 foot in comparison. Like many fictional snakes, it's thicker than a constrictor, yet appears to be venomous if the teeth are anything to go by. Despite this, Fang still takes its head off. The two are rapidly swept towards the waterfall, and try to use the body to hook themselves onto the rock, saving Fang but sending Spear smacking into the pinnacles below. And yet, Fang saves him, and returns his broken spearhead. The two have finally reached some equilibrium together, and now work effectively as a team to spear prey. Despite starting as 2 stubborn, independent heads of their own families, their partnership continues to grow. Episode 3, A Cold Death, opens in a blizzard, and through the ice and snow come a herd of woolly mammoths. Where other animals would be frozen in their tracks or forced to seek shelter, the mammoths persevere. And it's worth noting, mammoths aren't just elephants in blankets. They have generous layers of fat over their body, including a fatty camel-like hump over the shoulders, a thick 3-layered coat of warm fur, larger feet to spread their weight over the snow, and a sheath to protect their trunk tip in. They're very specialised proboscideans, and few terrestrial animals could possibly rival their ability to just sweep aside the most frigid of Ice Age blizzards. But not all of them are doing so well, and at the back of the herd an elderly mammoth lags behind. Her coat has become patchy and grey, and she's missing a tusk. She calls for her herd, but the wind snatches her voice away as the blizzard intensifies. Once cleared, she attempts to find them again, and comes to a steep slope. The apprehensive old mammoth begins a careful descent, when Spear launches his ambush. Sharp as his spear may be, he struggles to make a dent in the old mammoth, and as Fang leaps to his aid, even her jaws only succeed in making a superficial wound. Old as it may be, the mammoth is still tough, and sends the duo both down a snowdrift. It's clear to see, despite the fact the two are formidable together, their teamwork is still lacking greatly, and they open the hunt with ineffectual attacks as individuals. Picking the hunt back up, Spear leaps onto its tusk, and begins to bludgeon its eye, allowing Fang to get a lethal strike and knock the mammoth down. As Spear readies another blow, he hesitates on locking eyes with the mammoth, before steeling himself, and together Spear and Fang kill the old one. After the kill, Spear seems remorseful, and takes no pleasure in it, as he strokes the mammoth's head. But they don't have all day, and get to work butchering the carcass. Fang is noticeably more polite now, nudging Spear to make way rather than just diving in, and even tearing him off a piece. But once they've finished, it's pretty clear the communication between the two is still a bit lacking, when Spear winds up dragging the sled himself. The two quickly wind up lost in a blizzard, and make for a nearby cave to wait out the night. Back at the kill of the old mammoth, a pack of saber-toothed wolves feast on the body, but quickly scatter on the return of the herd. The matriarch of the group is a chestnut-furred beast with a tattooed forehead and amethyst eyes, and she tenderly caresses the body of her fallen family. This quickly turns to panic when she realizes the tusk is missing, and the group become enraged by this theft. Back in the cave, Fang feasts, but Spear isn't really hungry. Instead, he's drawn a cave painting, depicting him and Fang hunting the mammoth. Maybe a caveman/tyrannosaur team-up is rare enough that Spear felt it worth telling the world about. Or maybe he just enjoys making art. The scene becomes a flashback to Spear hunting with his son, and it seems it may have been the first time he took his child hunting with him. Together they use the tactic on a Synthecerus, the same one they used on the old mammoth, and Spear teaches his child respect and gratitude for the quarry. And clearly the memory of his family is still a raw one for Spear. But he gets little time to consider this, as the cave suddenly shakes. The ceiling begins to collapse and both just make it outside before it gives way, right into the enraged mammoth herd. With Spear literally wearing the hide of their dead family, there's no way this is a case of mistaken identity. The two are quickly outclassed, getting flung between muscular trunks and snow-ploughed tusks. Spear manages to grab a hold of the matriarch, and is seemingly crushed underneath her when she falls into the crumbled remains of the cave. Meanwhile, Fang defends herself with vicious snaps, and even manages to incapacitate one of the herd. This enrages the matriarch even further, who proceeds to begin killing Fang herself, crushing her with the broad flat of their heads as modern elephants do. Before she can be successful though, Spear re-emerges brandishing the tusk as his weapon. The whole herd is transfixed, and it quickly becomes clear just how much they want the tusk. Seeing this, Spear returns it, and the herd quietly leaves as the two watch in awe. The next day, the mammoths have arrived at a mammoth graveyard for a ceremony. Whilst elephant graveyards in real life are of course a Disney myth, elephants are well known for taking a great interest in their dead, and will often spend considerable time examining the bones and tusks of dead individuals. It seems likely that with their incredible sense of smell, elephants can identify their dead with these examinations, but this doesn't explain repeat visits in small spaces of time, or other behaviours. When elephants' temporal glands stream, it shows they're having an elevated emotional response, and elephants that had a relationship with dead individuals show this. Whilst applying human behaviours to animals is very frowned upon in the study of animal behaviour, known as anthropomorphization, it doesn't seem unreasonable that this response may be something similar to grief. The mammoths themselves place the tusk down and begin to sway. Each member takes a turn to stroke the tusk as they do so, and they form a ring around it. The matriarch of the herd has distinct markings on her forehead, and it seems these mammoths may have their own culture, somewhat more advanced than those of other animals. It's impossible to say what exactly this ritual is, and it could just be a way of remembering the dead for their own closure. But the swaying behaviour is one thing elephants may do to greet one another, or in some cases they form a ring around a calf and swing their heads to reassure and protect them. On top of this, it's later shown that a form of afterlife occurs for at least some beings in Primal, This may be a form of final meeting before the dead move on to another plane, or part of the ritual that has to be done to allow the dead to move on, only detectable to the mammoths. This explains the panic when the matriarch couldn't find the tusk. Without it, her herdmate, who may well have been a sister, mother, or aunt, may be trapped in a form of purgatory. No matter what it is, it's important to them, and it could be as simple as grief. Many things in Primal are exaggerated versions of their forms in our own world, and with their more advanced culture may come more advanced emotions that allow this herd to mourn their dead. Terror under the blood moon starts with Fang and Spear already in hot water, as they race over the horizon pursued by a gigantic pack of dromaeosaurs. Pack hunting in dromaeosaurs is a pretty common depiction, but one with very little paleontological backing. Considering the diversity of social structures and hunting techniques in modern raptors, it's not impossible. But it's something in some species, like Deinonychus, that we can have some reasonable confidence it didn't exist due to the differing diets of adults and young. The initial belief came from bone beds of multiple individuals, possibly gathered at kills, and it's possible that this is what this mega-association may be. The landscape of the blood moon is incredibly arid, and it seems hard to imagine it supporting such massive numbers of predators. It may be that it's been blighted by drought or changing weather patterns, and the more normally dispersed dromaeosaurs have all converged on the dried reed beds for shelter, any remaining prey, and the chance of water returning. But right now, the only prey they have is Fang and Spear. Individually, the raptors are no match for each of them, but as a swarm they begin to inflict damage. Against their sheer numbers, it seems unlikely the duo can hold out for very long, and as they cross the reed bed, they find themselves in a tense standoff. Everyone wants to eat, but none of the dromaeosaurs want to be the one to get demolished after the first bite. But luck seems on the protagonist's side. As with sunset, the dromaeosaurs quickly become uneasy and flee into the reed beds. As Fang and Spear turn to see the rising moon, they see it blood red above the Martian landscape. With no other option but to head further into the wastes, the two press on into the fog, and come across a monolith of carved skulls, maybe made by a civilization long past, or perhaps by the current residents to warn others away. Either way, Fang ignores it, and Spear follows. Pressing on, they hear wings above them, and take cover. From out of the gloom a hominid arrives, panicked and carrying a boar, but he's so preoccupied with watching the skies, he trips and damages his leg. Calling for help, the rest of the tribe begin to panic, with one large dominant male psyching himself up for the charge, that winds up being pretty short-lived as he's grabbed by something from the sky. Spear can only watch so much. He's naturally a protector of those weaker than him, and unable to tolerate senseless killing. He rushes out to seize both man and boar, and upon delivering them back home, both vanish. Behind him, the terror from the skies alights, a monstrous bat that slaps him into the open. They appear superficially similar to titanic vampire bats, walking well on all fours and blood red in colour. But, luckily for Spear, singly they're no match for Fang. The swarm descend and the pair are swamped, each killing numerous bats but almost getting carried off in the process. Eventually Spear loses his spear and is snatched, with Fang in hot pursuit. Spear struggles as best he can, with the frustrated bat knocking him unconscious. Giant bats or bat-like animals are steadily creeping their way into popular culture as a natural symbol of bizarre and hostile landscapes, and are very popular in assorted spec evo media and projects to become top-order carnivores, typically following a mass extinction. Whilst bats themselves never really reached such lofty heights in prehistory, there was Necromantis, a large predatory bat with an impressive set of jaws. Michael Habib has suggested a wingspan of around 3 meters for the largest bats, which is still considerably smaller than most fictitious bats, outside of perhaps the Futures Wild's death gleaners, a species very similar in behaviour to Primal's bloodbats. The bloodbats themselves seem something of an all-in-one package, with many of the tropes fictitious bats have. with their giant size, reasonable ground abilities, flight, and social habits, all making them incredibly potent predators. As Fang finally catches up, she comes across their roost. A great earthen spire, with the only entrance being a cave at the very top. This is the acid test for Spear and Fang, a chance for both of them to break and run whilst their partner is captured by the bats. But Spear saved Fang, and now Fang isn't leaving Spear. After a lot of miscommunication and false starts, the two are finally with each other for the long haul. After a lot of failed attempts, Fang plays dead and is gathered in by the bats. Inside we see the bats aren't picky. There are piles of dead mammals and dinosaurs alike, including theropods, big cats, rhinos and other ungulates that must have come from faraway lands. Venturing further inside, she comes across a hall, the walls lined with web cocoons. Tearing one open, she finds the preserved remains of another hominid. The question of what could have done this is swiftly answered, as a monstrous arachnid comes into view. Unlike any arachnid from our world, with fingered hands and a web gland in its three-part mouth, it tries to assimilate Fang into its larder. She puts up a fight, and successfully manages to find and free Spear, but is quickly overwhelmed. Spear manages to snap the horn off a cocooned triceratops, God knows how many bats it took to haul that in, and impales the spider before it can cocoon Fang. The situation only goes out of the frying pan and into the fire, as the entire roost of bats returns from the nightly forage. Thinking fast, Spear wraps the two of them in silk, and tackles Fang straight out the window, as they begin to try and put as much space between them and the bats as possible. Upon finding their spider dead, the bats become incredibly agitated. It seems the relationship between the two species was one of mutualism, the bats bringing back food for the spider, and the spider using its cocoons to preserve surpluses, so the roost had a lasting supply of food in lean periods. This is likely how the bats survive, and stay at such high numbers, in such an amazingly barren landscape. When one bat approaches the spider, it does so without fear or aggression, which does seem to suggest the relationship was a peaceful one. Real-life spiders can have similar relationships, and the most famous is one of various tarantula species with small frogs. The frogs live in the spider burrows, and seem to eat tiny invertebrates that a tarantula would struggle to prevent eating its eggs, whereas the frog gets a shelter protected by a tarantula. It seems that the tarantula recognizes certain chemicals in the frog's skin to prevent attack, as they do sometimes grab the frogs by accident but release them unharmed. Maybe the bats have a certain musk or other odour that has a similar function with the giant spider, and vice versa, as the bat did seem to approach the spider and smell it. These relationships also aren't limited to one species nor area, and are seen in both North and South America and in some Asian species too. Perhaps the arid regions of the world of Primal are dotted with these predatory alliances. Meanwhile, one of the hominids sees the pair coming, and grabs the spear he found earlier, returning it back to its owner. It's a small gesture after Spear saved the life of one of their number, but one that makes all the difference, and goes to show that good deeds still go reciprocated in a world some have tried to describe as grimdark. As Spear clearly needs his spear as the bats descend again, and much like the opening in reverse, the two are swarmed. Despite some impressive spear work, and Fang imitating Spear leaping from bat to bat, it's unlikely the duo can hold out for very long. Once again, the reed bed is their salvation, and though Fang is apprehensive to re-enter the raptor-filled field, she trusts him, and the raptors finally get a good meal as the two predators engage in a violent clash. The chase failed, the bats retreat to their now spiderless lair in the daylight, as Fang and Spear ride off into the sunrise. If it wasn't titled Rage of the Ape Men, in episode 5 it seems like Spear and Fang may finally get a break. The episode opens with them finding a beautiful oasis, and it seems the two can finally relax a bit. Their new paradise is a waterfall-fed freshwater lake, full of predatory naive fish. There's a sandy beach and a rockery to relax on, and it's well sheltered too. In short, it seems like paradise. Spear has some sushi, Fang gets harassed by a swarm of butterflies, and both manage to chill. After the madness of prior episodes, Spear seems genuinely at peace for once. As the two relax on the beach, a worm crawls out of Fang's footprint. She has a flashback to the river of snakes and panics, refusing to go back to Spear. We see later Fang doesn't mind swimming, and if she developed a phobia of everything that bit her, she'd never walk a single step. So it seems whatever venom the snakes have may well have been some pretty potent stuff. After eating the worm, Spear decides to go for a swim and explore the lake, whilst Fang makes herself comfortable, and the spot only seems to get more beautiful as dandelion-like pollen blows in on the breeze. Spear plans what would no doubt be a legendary practical joke on Fang, but before he can pull it off, he sees figures silhouetted on the surface. By the time he's out of the lake, Fang is abducted and has been dragged away. Seconds later, so is Spear. Coming to, he sees the figure of an ape man, before he's beaten unconscious yet again. The two awake bound by vines and hanging on the wall of a natural coliseum. 5 stone pillars lie before them, and on the rim of the arena, crowds of ape men scream and cheer. An individual dressed in a spotted cloak speaks, and we see he's addressing 5 champions, each enormous and more like a gorilla than the gibbon-like ape men in the stands. It's a full moon, and the sky has a sickly green tinge. The cloaked ape draws a circle, and each champion gathers round it to kneel as if in prayer, whilst he ascends the steps to a private podium, and battle begins. The champions fly into combat, the cloaked ape announcing every death with a double tap of his staff. Quickly it comes down to the final 2, a huge individual and one of a necklace of fangs identified in the credits as Krog. Much like Spear, Krog is a skilled fighter, able to take on opponents far larger in size. He uses speed and agility to manipulate enemies with greater strength, and successfully manages to take down his huge opposition. He then beats him to death while he's down, and Krog is the ultimate champion of the ape men. This form of gladiatorial combat is often seen in the pulp era of entertainment. In 1 million years BC, the men of the Rock tribe fight to gain leadership, and in Edgar Rice Burroughs' Barsoom series it also features, but it's most prevalent in his Pellucidar series. The hostile reptilian Mahars use the ape men like Sagoth to round up humans, who are set against, or rather fed to, beasts in the arena. The protagonists often find themselves in such scenarios, and there are also cruel beast fights between wildlife like thags and tarags, what we'd call Auroch and Smilodon respectively. The Sagoth are a lot like the ape men in the contest, and there are more typical and even more racist depictions of ape men in the series that are more like the slender audience in Primal. They still pitch such games on a smaller scale though, with the protagonists in At the Earth's Core being set against a Hyenodon, until the Sagoth arrive for their bounty. Such themes are popular across the genre, presenting ideas now regarded as cruel, backwards and archaic across much of the world. Not Spain though. And thus creating a world of exciting savagery and prehistoric ideals. But this was only phase 1, and the cloaked ape gestures for Fang to be lowered into the arena. Despite seemingly being outmatched, Krog is clearly looking forward to this. Next, Krog is given a choice of 3 skulls, a tyrannosaur, a mammoth, and a triceratops respectively. The reason for this is unknown. Maybe each skull represents an aspect of the animal it belonged to the champion wishes to convey. Maybe they're just there purely to impress and intimidate, or maybe it's something else entirely, and Krog picks the triceratops. Finally, the cloaked ape takes a shallow bowl of black tar-like fluid, letting a single drop flow down a carved path in the rock to where Krog awaits. This has a rapid effect, not only causing Krog to grow to enormous size, but also giving his skin a sickly green tinge, and causing his eyes to become blood red. In males at least, the serum seems to cause massive hypertrophy of the secondary sexual characteristics. Krog's musculature and canine teeth both grow disproportionately with his size, and for many primates these can be key features in setting males apart. It also seems to make anything that consumes it far more aggressive, and so whatever this serum is, at least one of the numerous effects it causes is an enormous spike in testosterone. Fang is dropped into the arena and prepares to fight, and things go badly. She is sent reeling from a backhand. She's strangled and headbutted across the arena. She manages to get a bite in, but it barely does anything to Krog. As Spear manages to bite himself free, Krog smashes Fang's leg and she's completely incapacitated. Before he can pulverize her, Spear intervenes and punches Krog's eye, only to be flung away. He sees the cloaked ape and makes a mad dash for him, followed by the other ape men. Flinging the cloaked one to his death, he then proceeds to down almost the entire serum. He grows even larger than Krog, and bellows a challenge to him that Krog willingly takes up. Despite an initial few good hits, Spear smacks that Triceratops skull right off his head, and then tears his arms off, utterly obliterating him. After seeing Spear effortlessly annihilate their ultimate steroid-enhanced champion, the rest of the ape men all reckon they've got a pretty solid chance at taking Spear down, only to be violently corrected. The rest try to flee, but Spear annihilates every single one of them. The next morning, Spear awakes from a pile of dead ape men. The threat is dealt with, but as he finds Fang, her condition is uncertain. Having just lost the most recent companion he'd made is just too much for Spear, and he howls in anguish. Just as he leaves, Fang coughs up some blood, and most crucially, is alive. Spear grabs some water, and handful by cupped handful, begins to rehydrate her. But they can't stay here forever. Vultures have begun to descend, and Spear is right to be cautious. He's almost certainly aware of the fact large carnivores will often watch vultures, and follow their path knowing it'll lead them to carrion. In the world of Primal, there's no telling what may show up with a scrum of vultures this large forming, and it's clear Spear and Fang can't just wait it out here to recover. Spear crafts himself a brand new spear, and begins to use the vines they were bound with, plus a bamboo stand, to form a sledge to carry Fang on. This is noteworthy, as much as Spear loves his spear and seems to be a basic caveman, he's clearly very intelligent, and not lesser to any other human. He can quickly build items, learn to use new ones he's never seen before. He improvises very well and shows good knowledge of tactics. So with a sledge made, he heaves Fang onto it and starts pulling. This is clearly an exhausting job, as Fang is literally an adult tyrannosaur, and probably weighs at least 5 tons. It's testament to Spear's strength that he can lift and pull it at all. Each step is a Herculean effort. One day down and Spear's hands are blistered and he's exhausted. And the two aren't alone. A solitary mammal watches them from a hill. A dog-like animal with large ears and red eyes. That night, Spear surrounds the two of them with campfires, but still the dog watches. The next day, Spear refines his strategy, and makes a harness to drag the sledge with. This is a far more efficient method of transport, and considering strongman competitions often involve dragging things like trucks or planes, a tyrannosaur on a sledge is not so unreasonable for an absolute unit like Spear. The pair are now followed by the dog, as well as a second one. The dogs are based on a mix of real animals, and have features of African wild dogs, aardwolves, batted foxes, and striped hyenas. The huge ears may suggest some role or ancestry as insectivores or small prey specialists, but the burly forequarters and sloping back suggests a hyena-like scavenging ancestry. Not all dogs have been the leggy marathon runners of the Holocene, and in prehistory there was a group known as the Borophaginae, the bone-eating dogs. They were often more robust than modern extant canids, and not as well suited to efficient movement over long distances, with stouter and more dexterous limbs. This family included the largest dog ever, Epicyon, but there were a number of smaller species between the size of a coyote or a domestic dog, that could well fit the role of the primal dogs. They're also reminiscent in role to Burroughs' Hyenodon, described also as wolf dogs in Pellucidar. They're very common and similarly ambitious in hunting, described as trying to take down an elephant-sized drith, or trunked megatherium in the first book of the series. Spear finds a cave that looks ideal for a good shelter, and chases off the pair of dogs, but Fang is still not back to strength yet, and now there are 3 dogs. That night in the cave, the two were swarmed with spiky arthropods. Their exoskeletons are razor sharp, and tough enough to withstand a spear jab from a weapon that pierced a tyrannosaur. Spear deals with the swarm by stabbing the soft undersides, and when cooked on a fire, the two now have something to eat. But the next morning, they're out of water. Spear is forced to blockade Fang as he goes on the search for more. In his absence, the dogs are keen to get in. It may seem a little much that such small predators want to hunt a literal tyrannosaur, but it may not be as far-fetched as some may think. Fang isn't exactly in mint condition, and modern predators like jackals, wild dogs and spotted hyenas are nothing if not cunning opportunists. African wild dogs typically hunt medium-sized ungulates like impala and kudu, but with changes in pack size and opportunity, are quite capable of scaling up their ambitions to larger prey, or less typical prey items. One pack in Tanzania took to hunting zebra with a far greater success rate than any lion pride or hyena clan, despite the far smaller size of the dogs. Spotted hyenas have no prey preference, and will eat whatever's going. This usually takes the form of the most common ungulate in the area, but also includes hippos, rhinos and elephants in the right circumstances, even adults. In the world of Primal, where every geological epoch is happening at once, a crippled tyrannosaur is absolutely fair game for such a pack of carnivores. Spear returns and chases the dogs away, and Fang is almost ready to move again, but seems uncertain about her leg. Spear convinces her to continue resting, and then comes up with the greatest invention of all time, bug knuckles. Preparing to chase the dogs off again, he now sees their numbers have grown quite considerably, into the hundreds. The pack rush for Spear, who manages to keep them at bay on top of the cave where they can only come at him one at a time. As the entire pack descends though, even he becomes overwhelmed, but Fang is now back to full strength, and emerges from the cave, sweeping great groups of dogs aside with her tail and eating multiple animals in a mouthful. The two of them beat back the pack, who decide to cut their losses and make a hasty retreat back into the woods. Spear and Fang are back, at full health and ready to take on anything. If only it stopped there. The next episode opens with a scene of peace. In an ancient plateau, a herd of sauropods build their nests. Their adults browse and socialize by the lake, and one individual spies a crop of fruit to eat on the far side of the clearing. The peace is shattered when a small Parasaurolophus enters the clearing, and you don't need to be a paleovet to tell it's in pretty poor shape. Bones are visible, there's fluid leaking from its eyes and mouth, and it seems blind and uncoordinated, unable to actually detect the sauropod and just biting at thin air. Unsettling as it may be, the sauropod ignores it and continues feeding, until the hadrosaur bites it in the leg. The sauropod promptly kills it by flicking it into a tree, and we see a bizarre transformation with its eye. A film or fluid seems to leak out of it, and it turns from a star-like pattern back to a normal eye. The sauropod thinks nothing of this little mosquito bite and returns to the herd. Literal moments later though, it's already in a bad way. The skin is now severely discoloured, there's already necrosis around the mouth, and the eyes and nostrils are streaming heavily. The sauropod drinks heavily from the lake, and then begins to projectile vomit gallons of blood back out. Its skin begins to slough off and finally, like the hadrosaur in reverse, its pupils contract and the pattern appears in its eye. The sauropod is gone. It begins an uncoordinated charge through the nests, crushing eggs and knocking down herdmates alike. One of them challenges the diseased individual, and what would normally be a bloodless tussle to reassign or assign dominance, ends with the challenger getting its throat torn out. The infected sauropod then proceeds to violently massacre the entire herd, running down the final individual to slam them into a thorned tree. With nothing left to kill, the exhausted sauropod itself collapses. The Plague of Madness clearly has aspects of numerous diseases from our own world, but compounded and exaggerated into a single devastating pathogen. So let's dig in and start by noting the symptoms. The disease is characterized by discolored tissue, excessive runoff from the eyes, nose and mouth, complete soft tissue autolysis and necrosis, massive internal hemorrhaging, and an altered behavioural state, exhibiting loss of coordination and extreme aggression. It's tempting to leap to the latter end of the symptoms. After all, this is what drives the story of the episode, but the slightly less dramatic ones may be ultimately more revealing. Rabies is known for progressing and incubating very slowly, with the onset typically occurring months after initial infection, but sometimes even years. The incredibly rapid progression of the disease, as well as symptoms like vomiting blood, seem similar to a viral hemorrhagic fever, the broad group of diseases best known through pathogens like Ebola or Marburg virus. They're zoonotic in origin, with a very short incubation, abrupt onset, rapid clinical course, and high mortality. So far so good, but can there be an ungodly combination of the two types of virus? Possibly. Baz Congo virus is a rare viral hemorrhagic fever, but one that's a rhabdovirus. This is the same family as rabies and other lysoviruses. It's highly divergent from others on its family tree, and it doesn't seem to cause any encephalitis or similar symptoms. But it's interesting and relevant for us, in that it's the same family as them, so to speak. The Plague of Madness may well be a divergent form of rabies-like pathogen in their world, one that kept the encephalitis that causes the behavioural changes, as it becomes a viral hemorrhagic fever to become the Plague of Madness. For the behavioural changes, they are undeniably similar to rabies. Before it attacks the herd, the sauropod seems drunk, staggering around through the nests, and the Parasaurolophus seems completely uncoordinated as it runs in circles. Even when chasing Spear and Fang, the mad sauropod crashes through or into objects. There are effectively two types of rabies: dumb or drunk rabies, technically known as paralytic rabies, and furious rabies, technically known as encephalitic rabies. It's not known exactly what causes one to become either paralytic or encephalitic, as different people bitten by the same vector can become either paralytic or encephalitic. Some changes are caused by severe infection and inflammation of the brain itself. The last symptom does seem to be behavioural change, so it does seem that in this regard the Plague of Madness functions like a lysovirus, with retrograde progression up the nervous system into the brain. Maybe the Plague of Madness is effectively both paralytic and encephalitic rabies combined. Photosensitivity is also a symptom of rabies, and may be one of the reasons for the pupil contraction, a response to let as little light into the brain as possible. The extreme autolysis and necrosis of the soft tissue also seems similar at a glance to necrotizing fasciitis, but the constant blistering and bubbling of the skin suggests something analogous to a rarer and more dangerous illness known as gas gangrene, typically caused by Clostridium bacteria. This causes massive, fast-acting tissue destruction and the release of gas from its breakdown. That can likely explain the bubbles in the sauropod's skin. Assuming the host survives, it can destroy huge areas of the body due to its ability to process connective tissues as well, allowing it to spread just about anywhere. But if this disease is so deadly, why isn't everyone going mad? And it could be a variety of reasons. Something like Ebola is relatively easy to destroy. Heat, sunlight, washing, and assorted enzymes will handily take care of it. So once the plague leaves the body, it may not last very long. It may also be transmittable only by saliva too. And even if transmittable via consuming flesh, it seems carnivores recognize the pathogen and instinctively avoid it. Not even flies touch the carcasses. Finally, it may be somewhat naturalized to the plateau. Perhaps most things living here have some immunity to it, and it's only non-avian dinosaurs that can catch it. Related viruses to Bas Congo virus show little effect in cattle species, and it suggested it came from cross-transmission via midges from an ungulate host. Maybe the plague was functioning in the plateau the whole time, until a midge vector bit an unlucky Parasaurolophus. Spear and Fang arrive on the scene, and are pretty taken aback by what they see. Fang is unwilling to even touch the mountains of free meat, and Spear seems horrified by the wanton killing. As the two regroup, the sauropod rises behind them, still very much alive and hell-bent on destruction. A chase begins as it pursues Spear and Fang into the forest, the sauropod shattering straight through the undergrowth in pursuit as they only just manage to stay ahead. The chase comes to a cliff. Spear and Fang manage to avoid the fall and leap inside a cave, whereas the sauropod topples over the edge. Disorientated by the fall, it thrashes around in the gully before collapsing, seemingly dead, and day turns to night. Out of nowhere, the sauropod attacks. It bites Spear, taking a chunk out of his torso, and instantly the plague sets in. He watches the flesh slough from his hands before his very eyes, and the same begins to happen to his head too. The sauropod tears into Fang, who promptly begins to melt down to the bone herself. Luckily, this is all just a dream. But it's worth noting, this is the first time in the season we see Spear genuinely terrified, and it's not even in real life. When faced with all manner of monstrous threats, Spear grits his teeth and readies for a fight. Even after the deaths of his family, he flew into combat and vengeance. The diseased sauropod is the only thing so far that seems to really cause genuine panic in him. Now awake, the duo are apprehensive. The sauropod seems dead, but it also did before when they first got into the clearing. Fang wants to stay put, and Spear wants to leave. After a quick discussion to review their situation, they decide to both go. A few dislodged rocks fail to stir the sauropod, and it seems Spear is right. Right up until he isn't, and the sauropod regains consciousness. The chase is back on, the sauropod drunkenly crashing against the walls of the canyon in pursuit. The giant is gaining on them until the canyon thins, and it becomes wedged in the opening. The dinosaur is stuck fast, and goes berserk trying to free itself, but it can't quite reach Spear or Fang. Nightmare seemingly over, the two now find they're in the caldera of an active volcano. The delicate ground beneath their feet cracks, and geysers of superheated rocks spray in front of them. Before they can head back though, the mad sauropod quite literally tears itself free, destroying its torso to do so. Suddenly changing their minds and deciding the magma isn't quite as bad, Spear and Fang run for it. The sauropod is too heavy and breaks through the crust. It emerges moments later, its remaining flesh burned horribly as the water in its body evaporates as steam. Spear sees to his horror it's literally hollow, a burning husk of a diseased animal, and as the two manage to leap to safety, the sauropod collapses into the lava. Its limbs literally burn apart and its body ignites. All the while the mad sauropod continues to scream. Spear and Fang can only watch as its body is reduced to cinders, and a remorseful Spear watches one cool to ash in his hand. Disasters can only have a moral if you survive them, and this may have been the sauropod's chapter, but in Spear and Fang's story, death was a release to it in the end, and then there is no real lesson for the characters to learn from this tragedy. Just acknowledgement and the hope of recovery. Sometimes the most or only conclusion you can scrape from certain experiences is just that you're still alive after it, and in a position to walk away, as sometimes a hostile pathogen you never knew existed can come out of nowhere and turn your life upside down, no matter what you did. Illness and death aren't always metaphors. Sometimes they're just the balance of odds running out. Following this nightmare, Spear and Fang spot a peculiar wave of light in the forest at night, and go to investigate. In a clearing surrounded by ruins, they come across a bizarre ritual. In the middle of a pair of stone pillars, a Neanderthal man covered in mysterious runes is tied, almost being burned by the fire below him. He's surrounded by a coven of antlered witches, who stoke the fire with herbs and begin an eerie wail. Their calls attract another, the chief witch, taller and silent and who moves in a stepless glide, with a giant pterosaur as her mount. The other witches seem to beg and pray to her, all except one, a smaller witch at the back who's conspicuously missing her antlers. The credits later identify her as Lulu. The chief witch uses her own magic to transform herself into something else entirely, a non-corporeal spirit that doesn't seem entirely of this world or dimension. In this form, she uses the runes to drain the Neanderthal of his essence, physical and spiritual, and reduces him to a crying infant who she then delivers to one of her subordinate witches, who jealously guards her new gift. For a show that's managed to remain relatively straight-laced, albeit hyper-violent and pretty generous with its physics, this is the first instance of flat-out magic in the series. It's tempting to say this may resemble ideals of neo-paganism or Celtic druidry, and it certainly invokes such thoughts with its imagery of runes and antlered witches. But overall, this cult is a bastardization of natural processes. Birth here is not a journey of courtship and growth, of two partners giving themselves to create another. It's the theft of an already existing life, warped to its base form so it can be rebuilt as the owner sees fit, really more akin to predation or parasitism. Other living beings are enslaved as mounts against their will, as we see with Fang that wild animals don't seem to enjoy this thought control. Overall, this cult is far from a celebration, but a mockery of life, that cannibalizes the living for its own ends. Spear and Fang are spotted by the pterosaur and are rumbled. Both try to flee, but become separated, and Fang is captured by Lulu. Spear is clearly disturbed by what he's just seen, but every time an attack is launched, the witches can instantly fade out of corporeal form. In short, this is an enemy that cannot be physically fought. For a pair of brawlers like Fang and Spear, it's no surprise they're both captured quickly. The two have been in some seriously close scrapes, but in this one, the enemy have literally just won a few minutes into the episode. Fang is made Lulu's mount, and Spear is the next sacrifice. Upon seeing Fang as Lulu's mount, Spear begins to scream, and the hex is almost broken on Fang. She bucks Lulu off and is close to regaining consciousness. A frustrated and curious Lulu freezes time and creates a portal to visit their past. It seems the Coven almost have some Black Mirror-like rewind setting. They can go back and review their own memories or those they've captured as a bystander. In doing so, she's horrified to see the instances that brought Spear and Fang together, learning that they were both parents once. She watches Fang's chicks hatch and then get eaten by the horned tyrannosaur. She watches the birth of Spear's second child, and him presenting them to the world, and then the fate of Spear's family. She's clearly upset by all this, and Spear even seems somewhat surprised by her mournful expression. Lulu leaves, and back at her home we see that just like Spear, she had made a painting on her wall of her and her daughter. Like Spear and Fang, Lulu was once a parent. Using a rewind portal, we see what happened. In a split second when she drops her guard as her daughter chases butterflies, she loses her. It's a tragic moment, and one Lulu has clearly visited multiple times before, and yet she still tries to warn her past self. Again, much like something from Black Mirror, this is probably a power that does more harm to you than good. What can it do to your mind to have this ability to repeatedly rewatch this in real time, and first person? It's also likely the reason Lulu has no antlers at the ritual. Considering the lengths behind each ceremony, losing a child probably isn't looked upon highly by the head witch. Lulu is also given the task of anointing Spear for the ritual. Freezing him to do so, Lulu is almost done, until a red butterfly lands on Spear, the same type as the ones her daughter chased in her last moments. Overcome with emotion, Lulu flees the scene on Fang. On the night of the sacrifice, everything happens as it did before, but just before the head witch can take Spear's essence, Lulu takes a stand. Killing the head witch's pterosaur, she then commands Fang to free Spear. The head witch takes this about as well as you'd expect, and transforms herself into a giant wolf. In response, Lulu turns herself into a giant crow, attacking her leader and allowing Spear to escape on Fang, who is no match for the head witch. The two fight, with Lulu managing to scratch her leader and almost escape, before she's caught and flung aside. Furious, the head witch advances on Lulu, who calmly accepts her fate. We see the mind control vanish from Fang, and it's clear what happened. The two of them do seem saddened by this, and recognise her sacrifice before riding away. And it was not in vain. The episode ends with Lulu in the same field she lost her daughter in, except now she finds her again. The two embrace once more and a bright light washes over them. The night feeder opens with a Smilodon on the prowl beneath a full moon. It senses something in the forest and prepares to fight, but whatever its opposition is, lunges at incredible speed. Back at their camp, Fang senses something, and that's all it takes for Spear to be on edge too. In the last few episodes, Spear has definitely been a lot more cautious, and this in part comes from having essentially unfightable enemies. But it's also that Spear is resembling the character we saw in the opening of the first episode too. It's quite possible he could have speared the Azdarkid or the Deinosuchus to death, but he couldn't take such a stupid risk when avoidance was the safer option. As the provider for his family, he couldn't afford the injury. It was only when he had nothing left that he literally tried to take on whole herds of mammoths, or multiple tyrannosaurs at once. With the strength of his friendship with Fang, Spear now really has something to live for again, and that actually means staying alive. The next morning, the two discover what's left of the Smilodon. Sabers snapped, an eye torn free, and its uneaten body shredded to red ruin. Fang is incredibly fearful, but it's worth noting the cloud of flies. Whatever this is, it's luckily not in quite the same league as the Plague of Madness. But whatever it wasn't good. Night falls again, and deep in the forest a herd of ceratopsians move through the gloom, perhaps Diabloceratops or Anchiceratops from the heads. As one stops for a drink, the Smilodon's killer finds them and launches its assault. We now see that it didn't take all night for the big cat to be left in such a condition, and that this monster can rend adult dinosaurs apart in a single strike. Ambushed in the trees, the herd panic and flee to an open clearing where they feel more comfortable. Forming a defensive ring, they put on an impressive display. A solid wall of bony crests and dagger-like horns that could put off any predator. The night feeder breaks the ring by laterally bisecting one of them. Their natural defense in ruins, the rest of the herd can only flee to be picked off one by one. Surplus killing like this is pretty rare in the wild. It's sometimes called henhouse syndrome, as we're more used to seeing it when a carnivore enters a pen where domestic stock are kept. When presented with a huge number of prey items which have their anti-predator behaviour bred out of them, it just keeps killing. Because for a carnivore, it's not advantageous for them to have an off switch. If a predator spared a potential prey item when it could kill it, it may not find another one for considerable time after, and risks starvation. But prey items have anti-predator mechanisms to prevent themselves being killed. Cryptic coloration so they can't be found, speed and agility to outrun predators, or large size and strength to stand and fight. So combine this with the fact carnivores generally can't be bothered to hunt when they're satiated, and it's very rare for a predator to ever find itself when it can kill multiple prey items in a group. It only really happens in freak weather conditions like storms when they can't flee, or in droughts when they're too weak to fight. But for the night feeder, it doesn't matter what species or condition the prey is in. The pinwheel formation the ceratopsians made was their anti-predator defense, one good enough to see off any predator, that the night feeder sliced straight through. Whatever has happened to the night feeder, it's now so powerful and so fast there doesn't seem to be anything it can't catch and kill. No matter what the anti-predator defense is, it won't work. The night feeder is the fox, and now the entire forest is its henhouse. For Spear and Fang, they can only listen. As said before, Spear can't stand senseless killing, and grabs his own weapon to go and help. Fang absolutely forbids this, and there's a tense moment between the two before Spear concedes. Now all they can do is sit by the fire and listen to the slaughter. The next morning, Spear still seems upset, and there's another tense moment as something approaches. But luckily it turns out just to be a small theropod hunting flies. After seeing great flocks of crows head to the night feeder's devastation, the two decide to move on. Paranoia has now set in. In a blustery storm, the two shelter behind a rock, and each creaking tree or branch could be the night feeder. That night, it takes the two time to nod off beside the campfire, each snapping twig jolting them back awake. Once the two are asleep though, the fire blows out, and the night feeder approaches. It separates the two by knocking down a tree, and goes for Spear, slashing down half the forest to try and catch him. Fang follows and manages to land a hit on the monster. She comes away with her face covered in tar as she goes berserk trying to get it off. The two then try and confuse it, each running and screaming to try and get its attention. The frustrated night feeder makes a deafening screech, and just before it can go for Spear, he startles it by striking a spark. It goes in again, but this time he creates an open flame, and the beast leaves in a panic. The balance of power has just shifted. The greatest anti-predator mechanism hominids have always had rises to the surface. Intelligence. The next night, Spear and Fang herd it to a patch of trees. Its speed is made useless due to Spear now knowing its pyrophobia, and the hunter has become the hunted. Together they trap it in a ring of fire. Spear then impales it in the chest and it sets alight. The tar-like substance it's covered in ignites, and the monster is incinerated as the two watch with disdain. There's some parallel with the mad sauropod here too. Both were aggressive monsters that killed everything in their path, and were destroyed by fire. But one was a victim with no control over its actions, whereas the other was lucid and seemed to revel in its own brutality. One had Spear's pity, and the other his hatred. But perhaps the biggest question, and perhaps the most popular theory discussion of the first season of Primal was, what was the Night Feeder? The most frequent and reasonable explanation is that it's a small theropod that effectively overdosed on the super steroid, as seen in Rage of the Ape Men. The theropod is covered in a similar tar-like substance, and is bestowed with the similar abilities of hyperaggression, strength, and exaggerated weaponry. Fang panics when she comes into contact with it, and we see from her worm experience that she can develop phobias. It's hard to think of a better scenario to develop a phobia from than getting beaten near to death. The sickly green tinge around a full moon is seen in both occasions too, and maybe this bizarre oil isn't made, but could be a natural substance, or at least there may be a raw form of it. Maybe the lunar impact causes it to bubble up from certain deposits in the ground, or causes certain plants or fungi to produce it for collection. Smart as some dinosaurs, including Fang herself, may be, it doesn't seem likely that the Night Feeder brewed this substance itself. Some have even suggested that, like the little theropod seen chasing flies, the Night Feeder deliberately kills large animals in the night, then transforms back to feed on the flies they attract in the day. But this seems a little bit 3D chess for a dinosaur, even a troodontid. A point against this theory is that in the initial storyboards, the Night Feeder seems much more like some weird muck monster, and it may not be the intention for it to be related to the little theropod. But either way, it still seems that this is the most likely explanation from what we have. The final episode shows Spear and Fang on a relaxing fishing holiday. Well deserved, considering the last few months have effectively been a series of traumatic waking nightmares. As Spear readies his thrust, he's surprised by a woman emerging from the ocean. She heads into the forest at once, and it turns out she is being pursued by a pliosaur, which attacks Fang. Spear saves her and then sets off into the forest after the woman. Once he's caught up, things are tense. Considering she's just escaped from a slave ship and was chased by a sea monster, she's more than just a bit on edge. Spear means no harm though, and begins to try and make her feel at ease, but Fang quickly ruins it. Catching her again, Spear calms Fang down, and then both submit in an attempt to try and keep things friendly. It's worth noting too that the bulk of other hominids Spear has met over the past few months haven't exactly been friendly. So this is as much a leap for him to trust as well. Again, it shows Spear's nature as someone trying to believe in good, and who wants to give the benefit of the doubt. Despite his mimetic reputation, Spear isn't a naturally violent man, and only fights when he has to. Spear sees she's cold, and makes a fire for them all. Things are slowly getting there, and in the night, Spear notices the woman seemingly in prayer to the moon. The next day, she makes a choice. Between venturing into this world alone, and going with Spear and Fang, she chooses the latter, no matter how scary they may be. And Spear seems pleased. If nothing else, they didn't eat her in the night. Later, the three all enjoy a nice dinner of raw ungulate. Or rather, two of them do. It's not quite to the woman's taste. Instead, she picks some bizarre things that are apparently called vegetables, and makes a stew. As Spear watches with uncertainty, Fang is instantly a fan and steals a piece. But Spear isn't really on board with things. But it does show that everyone is making an effort to try and accommodate and learn from each other, and the woman seems to have won their trust as much as vice versa. Again that night, Spear watches as she begins her lunar prayer. The next morning, Spear and Fang free her from her shackles, and she introduces herself as Mira, albeit to little understanding. Mira begins to craft her own items and builds herself a bow. Spear slowly starts to warm to Mira's cooking, and the friendship only grows as he flashes her his most winning smile. Spear still can't understand her though, but when Mira draws in the sand, being something of an artist himself, Spear joins in, drawing the branding on the back of her head. It seems he's asking her how she got it, and the two now have a method of communicating. Mira now draws her history, telling him how she used to live far away in a village of family and love, before they were attacked. The newcomers burned the village, killed many, and took even more captive. They were taken back to a sad land of darkness and cold, and became slaves. Some were made to work, but others were sold for food or money. Mira escaped, and found herself with Spear and Fang. It's unknown exactly how much of this Spear understands, but it's made clear that he's aware Mira's enslavement was from the horned figure, the one some have taken to calling the Scorpion. The group continue to search for new places to rest, passing colourful dinosaurs and swimming through tropical rivers, and despite her unusual friends, Mira seems to feel at peace. They find a decent-looking cave, and Mira and Fang bond as she lures her up with the prospect of grubs. Spear is delighted. That night in the cave, he asks Mira about the moon. Mira tells him it's her heart, her hope, and her faith. Just as Spear draws his own strength from the sun, Mira does from the moon. And it doesn't seem likely Spear understands what she says, but it's probable that he understands its importance to her. He may not understand the words, but he seems to get the message. And clearly he seems to think about it before he goes to bed. Maybe realising that Mira may be going through the same feelings he went through in the first episode. Fang is woken by something rustling in the cave, and wakes Spear just in time to save him from a stone club. Mira has been captured by a group of vicious ape men, and this turns out to be the biggest mistake of their now drastically shortened lives. Fang sweeps dozens out of the cave, and Spear grabs Mira's bow to great effect. Together, they completely annihilate the ape men. The race is now on to find Mira. They follow her screams and find the ape men dead. They've been killed by fletched arrows, and their killers walked on sandaled feet. The two hear another scream and race to the beach, to discover they're too late. The Scorpion has recaptured Mira, and the season ends with Spear speaking his only word in it. Mira. Episode 10 leaves us with a fat ton of questions. How are Spear and Fang going to get Mira back, and where is she being taken? Who is the Scorpion, and is he a mythical figure like the head witch with his horns? Or a barbarian warlord, not unlike a villainous version of Spear himself? Are we even going to get to him in the next season? What locations, creatures and nightmares are going to come in the next 10 episodes? Happily, many of these are answered in Season 2, and you can watch the video breaking down that season right now as well. Later this year there will also be a Season 3, confirmed by Tartakovsky to be an anthology series, that I'll likely be covering on this channel too. Overall, Season 1 was a hell of a ride, and even without a linking narrative throughout many of the episodes, through Fang and Spear and other characters we still see the bonds that can form from trauma like new growth after a wildfire, the power cooperation can bring over conflict, the lengths we'll go to seek closure, that the smallest of deeds can make all the difference, that just because you need help it doesn't mean you're weak, that the greatest tragedies have no victors, only victims, that there's always a chance for redemption, the difference a single spark can make on the darkest nights, and that no matter how great the loss is, there's always the chance of another connection. It was also beautiful, and almost every episode quite literally is every frame a painting, with several particular standout scenes. For me personally, episode 4 was especially noteworthy in an artistic sense. Whereas other episodes are often in soft, neutral or natural colours, everything in Blood Moon is red, and it had perhaps the gnarliest enemies and allies against a barren Martian wasteland. Here, every frame is an 80s metal album cover that would make Frank Frazetta proud. On that note, Frazetta's artwork is clearly as much an inspiration for Tartakovsky as the stories he illustrated, and as a form of modern pulp, Primal is immensely enjoyable. But that's not to say it lacks good writing. Only a good writer can tell a story with no dialogue, and I think both seasons of Primal are a genuine marvel in this regard. I generally think all of the episodes are pretty solid writing-wise, but obviously Plague of Madness is probably the emotional standout, and the most memorable episode of both seasons so far. Cold Death is also pretty good, and I think River of Snakes is actually a really solid one too, just on how much legwork it has to do to build Spear and Fang as a convincing partnership, but without it feeling rushed. The weakest episode overall is probably The Night Feeder, with relatively repetitive story threads and the rushed ending. Overall, I think the structure of Series 1 is also really good as well. The first half of the series introduces us to the characters, and then very steadily builds them up as a duo, with them meeting in Episode 1, actually learning to function full stop in Episode 2, having some pretty middling teamwork in Episode 3, actually properly trusting each other in Episode 4, and then all of that being put to the test in Episodes 5 and 6. Which essentially serves as a final exam for their friendship. With that point being established, the series then pulls the rug out from under Spear and Fang, giving them a series of essentially superpowered enemies that they can't just muscle their way through, forcing them to think differently about how they approach such conflicts, as well as just upping the stakes on the individual stories. Season 1 of Primal overall really is a fantastic piece of entertainment. Thanks for watching. And as ever, a huge thanks to my patrons: Bonecrusher Hyena, Toxic Wolf, The Supras Duper, Samburgo, K. Sandom, Octavia of the Fifth Fleet, Nickname 3110, Eringar Steiny, Kieran McCarthy, Flygon's Archives, Hui Hui, Jabin, The Belted Horned Warbler, Big Man Blastoise, Nathan Cross, Tim Gojira, Teddy KGB, Waffle, Dapper Raptor, Godzilla Prime 2, Original Username, Evilly, Howleth, Archosaur Queen, Tommy Choi, Jacob Wilcox, Seth Fake Last Name, Zeusir, Dodecablos, and Bazugazu Bakuhatsu, whose generosity helps keep the channel going. A link is provided in the description if you ever felt like joining up yourself, and any amount is always appreciated. Please do share this video as well. The original one got to over 1.5 million views before it was zucked by YouTube. And it would be nice to get those numbers again, even if unlikely. This was also the first video of its kind that I made that followed an actual narrative, so as ever, please do let me know what you thought of it. I am always keen to do more media outside of Monster Hunter, although I went with a chronological episode-by-episode format for Primal, as I also wanted it to serve as a recap before future seasons, and as a guide to anyone who hadn't maybe seen it. I also added and subtracted a few points where I felt relevant too. Hopefully it makes for a more concise video. If this is your first video of mine, this channel often deals much more with Monster Hunter and its assorted wildlife, but occasionally other monster or paleo media too, So if you like this, why not check out some of my other videos as well, and consider subscribing if you want more. Hopefully I'll see you for the next video, which will be a mystery as I haven't decided what to cover yet.